Welcome, everybody. The Emil A. and Jenny Fish Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Yeshiva University is proud to welcome you to the second installment in our series, What is the Holocaust Today? This monthly series is a multidisciplinary exploration of the Shoah's ever-changing and everlasting impacts on our lives and the world we live in. Each month, we'll feature a distinguished guest speaker who's leading and innovating in their field, reaching across multiple disciplines. I'd like to personally thank Dr. Sheinfeld, Director of the Fish Center, Hodaya Blau, Coordinator at the Center, and the students at the Center who helped make this event possible. This episode, which is our second installment, as well as our previous episode with Dr. Katarzyna Persan, along with other archived content, will be available on our YouTube channel, also accessible through the YU Fish Center website. I'd like to thank our co-sponsor of this event, the Young Israel of Jamaica Estates. After the presentation by Dr. Schulman, everybody can, as we go, post questions in the chat, and at the end, we'll be doing a little bit of Q&A. We might not be able to get to every single question, but we will do our best. Dr. Schulman this week will be discussing preservation, commemoration, restitution, and the politics of memory, Jewish heritage and Holocaust sites in Poland. So I'd like to, before I introduce Dr. Schulman, just tell you a little bit about her. Dr. Beata Schulman was born and raised in Poland. She discovered her Jewish ancestry in her early teens, and since then, she's dedicated her life to studying and teaching Jewish history and the history of the Holocaust. Dr. Schulman earned both her master's degree and PhD in geography and religion from Jagiellonian University in Krakow. She was awarded a Junior Fulbright Advanced Research Grant for her doctoral research and was a visiting scholar at New York University. Dr. Schulman has worked at the Auschwitz Institute for Peace and Reconciliation, organizing seminars in Auschwitz about genocide prevention for government officials and military officers. She's also worked for the Museum of the History of Polish Jews, the Jewish Community of Warsaw, and the Foundation for the Preservation of Jewish Heritage in Poland. From 2014 to 2020, Beata worked as Executive Director of the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial Foundation for the preservation of the Auschwitz-Birkenau Memorial Site and building Jewish leadership for the site. She currently shares her time between research, lecturing, and work in the development fundraising field. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Schulman.
Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us this beautiful afternoon in New York, especially. Finally, it's a beautiful weather, and thank you for being on Zoom instead of outside. Special thanks for Fish Center, to Shai and Sari and Hodaya for arranging this and hosting me. Thank you for all who joined. I see here also people from many different parts of my life, and it's a big pleasure to see you all on Zoom as well today. As Sari introduced me, I am originally from Poland. I moved to the United States about 12 years ago, and I have been working in commemoration and preservation and restitution projects with many different organizations in Poland for about 20 years now. This lecture I gave in many different pieces to many different audiences, but this is something which I always wanted to put together to give a larger historical framework or timeline of what was done with the Jewish heritage in Poland after the World War II. I'm going to share my screen with you. And let me just fully share the presentation. Oh, we need to go back. My apologies. It starts from the slide 6. I would like to dedicate my lecture to one of my mentors and role models, Yani Aguerski. He passed away about a year ago. He was a geochemist, Pole, who lived in Poland, but he had also an amazing interest in Jewish heritage. He co-founded in the 80s an organization which was called the Social Committee for the Preservation of Jewish Cemeteries and Monuments. He co-founded this organization with a Righteous Among the Nation of the World, Eric Lipinski. And for many, many years since then, he dedicated his life to documenting and commemorating many different sites all over Poland. From 1991, he became a head of a documentation department of the Jewish Historical Institute. And he was the most humble and welcoming person for all young researchers in Poland. He taught us everything, opened his archives, showed us everything, introduced us to everything, and allowed us to explore more, commemorate more, do more to make sure that the sites in Poland are commemorated. And he is one of those bright lights in Poland that allowed many, many, many positive things to happen. And as I'm dedicating this lecture to him, I want to also mention that commemoration of Jewish heritage and Holocaust sites in Poland would not be possible without tremendous work, which is done by Polish partners and Polish volunteers and local activists. In 1998, over 20 years ago, American attorney from Chicago, Michael Tracin, funded an award for Poles who rescued Jewish heritage, and that award is called Preserving Memory. And every year during Jewish Festival in Krakow, the new group of people received this award. Since the award was funded, over 150 individuals and local organizations have been awarded. And this is a really amazing trend which is happening in Poland, that heritage, which was not taken care of properly for many, many years, is now being taken care of with a lot of love by the local communities. When I'm speaking about Jewish heritage and Holocaust sites in Poland, after 1945, I just want to list for you things which I will be talking about during that lecture. Definitely this will be Jewish cemeteries, synagogues, other communal buildings. It can be a mikvah, it can be a school orphanage, or the local building of Poalei Tzion, Agudat Israel, or Kashomer Chatzari, or any of the Jewish organization. Or there are also remains of concentration camps, death camps, labor camps, ghettos, execution sites, deportation sites, hiding spots of Jews, or places connected to Righteous Among the Nations, and of course, thousands of mass graves. I want to give you a historical timeline, what happened with those places after the liberation. And I'm going to start with the first historical period, which is the first 10, 11 years after the liberation. And that I would describe this as a chaos and a terror of Stalinist era. Poland was liberated by Soviet army and was not willingly placed under Soviet influence. The political situation was very unstable. There were for many years still fighting between anti-communist underground and Soviet-supported governments. Poland was what I would describe in a total ruin. And here you have just two pictures from Warsaw, the most unthinkable ruin of all the towns, with almost 80% of the town building being destroyed. There is a picture of a girl looking at the ruins of Ghetto. You see here just a rubble. And some other places in Warsaw. Poland not only became a ruin during the war, but also lost 20% of its population. And I'm not speaking only here about the 10% of it, who's probably 10% is Jewish community, but then also members of Polish community who died during the bombings, during defending their country, fighting for the country, being sent to concentration camps or labor camps, and dying from bad conditions. What's really important to emphasize here, because when we're speaking about rebuilding the country, it's important to understand that in this group, in this 20%, a lot of people were the intelligentsia. Nazi Germany went after Polish, not only Jewish, but Polish doctors, lawyers, and anybody who can lead the country. Poland lost about 30% of their medical doctors, a similar amount of their lawyers, scientists, professors, and teachers, and many people of skilled professions. Those people who were in the intelligentsia, who would be able to think about rebuilding society, keeping certain memory alive. So what happened, and here I just want to show you this one poster. And what it says. It basically says we are building a new culture for the happiness of the country and for the peace in the world. That poster shows Polish men and women, the strong rebuilders, but it also represents the country. The country changed. Almost everybody in post-war Poland was Polish and Roman Catholic. Germans needed to move to Germany, Ukrainians east, and in these artificial borders, the country became very homogeneous. Population of cities and town was also relocated and reshuffled. People moving from east taken to the houses and properties in the West, which were left by Germans. Many of the Jews were also relocated to these areas in Lower Silesia. And communities were being rerouted in the sense that if you had memories from one particular town when you grew up, you not necessarily lived in this town. Look, Warsaw was destroyed. So this society rebuilt itself, sometimes relocating in many different places, and also for based on the economical reasons. During that era, the industrialism started, and rebuilding the country through building a strong industrial economy. What happened with the survivors is survivors started gathering at first in big towns. Many towns didn't have any survivors, or one or two survivors, or one family who survived. And coming back, especially to small town, became very dangerous. There was a huge anti-Semitism. There were anti-Semitic pogroms in Poland. So Jewish population concentrate in larger groups in big cities, and in particular cities and towns of Lower Silesia, where there was quite good housing to house the survivors. Survivors were in pretty bad physical and mental state. That's why we cannot really speak too much about them spearheading from the very beginning an effort of commemorate or take care of the properties left in different towns. The first things needed to be done first, of course, is the health and rebuilding life in a way that they were able to follow with other things. The Central Committee of Polish Jews was created, and under this organization, a historical commission was created, the Central Jewish Historical Commission, which took upon themselves to take as many testimonies as possible. And the reasons for these testimonies to be taken is, of course, accounting of the victims, reuniting families, conducting trials, and governmental organizations as well. There was a special commission of investigating Nazi crimes, and those testimonies were taken. And that documentation really became a first part of commemoration of the Holocaust, even though it was not a commemoration in physical space, but that documentation was the first very important piece. What happened with the communities and the properties which they were using? After the war, within the borders of Poland, there was about 1,200 cemeteries, Jewish cemeteries. Only 68 of them were used after World War II. And properties which were not used, or there was no survivors in that particular communities who were able to, I would say, able or capable of negotiating with the local government the fate of those properties in many times were lost. The government decided to nationalize abandoned property, Jewish property, German abandoned property, or property of Poles who also died during World War II, but also in general, property of citizens, because it became a Stalinist communist country. And during that time, when the property was what's it called, liquidated, there were special offices of liquidation, the fate of certain places was being determined. And if there was a congregation, if there was a group of survivors and they were using a synagogue or they were using a school, government most likely gave them a permission to use that place. Sometimes they were able to still own it. In many cases, it was already a governmental property. And the life continued at that place. But what happened with those places which didn't have anybody left? Those places were liquidated, and it really depends on a person who was conducting work, administering the local community. We lost a lot of intelligentsia in Poland. If it was a not skilled person who was just working for a communist government, they didn't care, and they liquidated 260 Jewish cemeteries, which halachically, from the point of view of Jewish law, was really difficult. That place should be especially protected. The ground should not be break. Nobody should dig or do anything with the bones. And 260 cemeteries were officially liquidated. On many of them, there were no gravestones because the gravestones were taken to pave the roads. And you will see on the next slide, the government at the very beginning had a still idea of maybe we should do something with those gravestones. So they made, it's not really a law, but an appeal to the community saying, if you see that the roads are paved with Jewish gravestones, please return it to the Jewish cemeteries. But that was not really followed. Still, out of this 1,200 cemeteries, 260 of them were liquidated, and other things were built on them, or they were turned into parks. In a good situation, the two of the places were turned into swimming pools. Free cemeteries were turned into bus stations. So that was a terrible loss for the Jewish community. But if there was a survivor who was able to say something and who was able to negotiate with the local authorities, things were able to be taken care of in a better way. Like, for example, in the town of Kutno or in the town of Łęczna, the local community or local representatives of survivors were able to negotiate with the local organizations that, for example, for fencing and protecting Jewish cemetery, they are going to give a building of synagogue to a fire station or something which would be used in a, let's say, more or less proper way. Many synagogues, speaking about other buildings, many synagogues were destroyed during the war, and others were turned into places with uses which would really kind of desanctify the place, make the, so grain storage, any kind of storage, something connected to taking care of animals, stables, just to diminish the importance of the place. And depending on what was the state of the architecture of the synagogue, if the synagogue building was quite good, the local government would decide to do something in there, moving cultural organizations, school. Some places stayed the storage facilities, and some places, some synagogues were basically demolished after the war because there was no use for it. They were already in a bad state, or became ruins and stayed ruins till almost till today. So that's the sad story of the properties in the first years after the war. But on the commemoration side, first museums were being created and first commemoration efforts were being made. And of course, the easiest one for the government were those liberated by Soviet army. So here we have Majdanek and Auschwitz-Birkenau, and those places which had diverse group of victims. So it's not only Jews, but it's also Polish citizens, maybe like in Auschwitz, Russian POWs. And those places were able to be commemorated or protected at first place. In Majdanek, the commemoration and preservation efforts started in 1944. In Auschwitz-Birkenau, it started in 1946. Just after war ended, and after the survivors were able to gather and really create a plan for the museum. In both museums, Auschwitz-Birkenau and Majdanek, opened in 1947. And it was a very important step because opening those places so early protected many of the artifacts. And those artifacts now are saved as evidence of the crime that Holocaust actually happened. Because when we think about other places like Belzec, Sobibor, and Treblinka, almost nothing was left. That's why those places were not taken care of in the very beginning. There were some talks in early years about creating monuments, and plans were made, but unfortunately, these places for years after the war were neglected, and not only neglected, but also many grave diggers started plundering through for the mass graves and through ashes of the victims. So the issues of those sites were very, very disturbing. Works also started in a commemoration of other places which were kind of more intact, that had actual structures of the former camps, like Stutthof or Gross Rosen, but those places were not open yet during those years. One of important memorials and one of the first monuments which was opened for commemorating Holocaust was the memorial of Warsaw Ghetto heroes. And as you see, this is people walking towards the commemoration to this monument. They are still walking through ruins of Warsaw. That monument was opened in 1948. 3 years after war was officially over, but still state of Warsaw. Warsaw took years and years to rebuild. And now when we think about commemoration efforts, the cities took years and years and years to rebuild. Similarly, commemoration effort took years and years. I'm going to move to post-Stalinist era. The first years, the two important things which happened in 1956 and 1958 was commemoration of synagogues in a couple of places, that local communities realized that certain things are important to be saved and preserved. And here I want to acknowledge in 1950s, town of Weinzut decided to demolish former synagogue, even though it's beautiful inside, but they determined maybe it's not important enough to renovate. But there was a person who stood for the importance of that. And here is the role of intelligentsia, people who understand the importance of commemorating and preserving the history of the town. And that person was Dr. Władysław Bilicki. He basically took people in the town. He was very well-respected medical doctor, so people listened to him, and he explained to them, this is our heritage. Our town is going to celebrate 600 years of its establishment. We need to preserve it. Let's create a museum. We are having this big celebration. This is an empty building. What about we use it as an exhibition place? And in this way, he was able to persuade locals to not demolish the building, to open at first exhibition place in there, and then it was turned in the 60s into museum. Very similarly, the old synagogue in Krakow was taken care of by local government. They decided to renovate it and turn it into a department of Museum of City of Krakow as the important historical monument. And that picture over here is from 1958, and that synagogue is being dedicated as the museum. In the 60s, many more monuments were being erected. And this one, for example, is 1964 monument in Płaszów. Płaszów still does not have a proper museum, but it has a monument. There was first monument in Sobibór, the first monument in Treblinka. There was some fencing done around the area of Bełżec to protect the area from further grave digging and plunder. At that time, in 1960s, almost all Jews who survived left. There was probably about 30,000 Jews still left in Poland. And those who stayed were spearheading commemoration in the country and working with the local community. There was more things being done. Some local groups, and especially offices of conservation of monuments, archaeological groups started work on Jewish cemetery in Krakow. There was many more this kind of brutalist look monuments in the 60s created on Jewish cemeteries. And whenever there was a survivor who was able to work with a group of survivors from the same town who were in different country, they were trying to do something in the 60s. And especially during 1967, when there was a 25th anniversary of liquidations of many ghettos, those monuments were made and dedicated, and some of the local community came and commemorated as well. Unfortunately, many good things happening slowly were slower down even more because of anti-Semitic campaign in 1967 and 1968, following up the Six-Day War in Israel, when Soviet Union supported Arab states. During that time, Poland started anti-Semitic campaign, and many of the Jews who still felt in Poland like in home. Look, almost everybody left, but there was a group of Jews. Most of them were not very connected to their Judaism or Jewish and the identity. They felt more Polish. Many of them stayed in Poland. And it came a time of this terrible anti-Semitic campaign when once again they felt unwelcome. And many of them received a ticket one way to leave the country. It was a terrible loss for the community, and many people thought that the Polish Jewish community after that will cease to exist. The community was very weak, and it consisted mostly from elderly men who met in the synagogues from time to time. The next generation was not really coming into any particular groups and learning and participating in cultural events. There was some, I would say, government-directed activity of Jewish culture, for example, Jewish theater, and there was still a group in TSKZ, one of the cultural association, which was still meeting, but still the activities stay very, very small during the beginning of 70s. Many things changed as the second generation, the boomers, grew up to be young adults. Many of them had friends who stayed in touch with those who left in 1968, and they were really looking towards the West, and they wanted not only to learn more about their Jewish culture, commemoration, Holocaust, all the topics which were not really taught in schools, but they also were starving towards all the Western society, music and everything. And opposition of Poles was slowly creating to overturn Poland being fully dependent on Soviet Union. Young Poles and Jews started meeting and discussing Jewish topics. And one of those initiatives was Jewish Flying University, which was created in 1979. And following that, all those institutions like Social Committee for Preservation of Jewish Cemeteries and Monuments, all those people interested in Jewish topics figured out the way of a small outlet, which was a bit underground, to meet and discuss and see what can be done. Path of democracy took another 15, 20 years, but a lot of things opened up in Poland already in the 70s and the 80s. In 1983, on the 40th anniversary of Ghetto uprising, the Warsaw Nożyk Synagogue was renovated by the government. Somehow in the 80s, thankfully, relationship between Poland and Israel started warming up. There was still no official relationship, but in 1986, there was already a Polish business office in Tel Aviv. In 1988, there was a year when many things happened. Umschlagplatz Memorial in Warsaw was erected. 1988 also, First March of the Living arrived in Poland. Nissenbaum Foundation started commemoration and restoration efforts. I run through and it didn't follow with the slides. I need to go back then. In 70s, there were 2 synagogues, which is very important to show by the local communities what was done. One is in a very small community of Nasielsk. It's a beautiful little synagogue with beautiful polychromic paintings, and the most famous in Poland, one of the Leviathan. That synagogue was renovated in the 70s and turned into a library. A town of 600 people decided that it's important to do that, and the best use of the synagogue would be to have a library there, which is a beautiful effort. In another town, in Tykocin, Dear Beautiful Synagogue was also taken care of and renovated and turned into a museum in 1976. But going back to the 80s, sorry, I jumped through but didn't go for the slides. This is the slide of Jewish Flying University, and one of the first Pesach Seders of Polish and Jews meeting together. I'm not sure if it was in the house of Kostek Gebert or Staszek Krajewski, both amazing Jewish leaders of the second generation. And the amazing things which started happening in the 80s, Nissenbaum Foundation, which started spearheading many different local projects, finding local partners and commemorating Jewish cemeteries and synagogues. March of the Living. In 1989, Jewish festival in Krakow started. And many different people started coming to Poland, being interested in what is left there. Rabbis like Rabbi Besser and Rabbi Lieber, philanthropists like Ronald Lauder, all good things started happening quite quickly. And it all kind of exploded in the 90s. March of the Living exploded into a large international event, similarly as Jewish Festival in Krakow. And those interests, both from the Americans coming and Israelis coming and Jews from all over the world, but also locals seeking information about Jewish heritage, spearheaded a different thing, a revival of Jewish life in Poland. A lot of Jews who stayed there stayed undercover. Many people like we grew up, we didn't know that we have Jewish roots. And the interest of the local Poles is what made many of us seek information about our Jewish culture. If somebody learned that you're Jewish or you have Jewish roots, then that person would treat you as an expert on Jewish issues. When I was a teenager, I had no idea what I was talking about, but everybody was asking me those questions, so I decided to learn. And it was really interesting time that it was almost like trendy to be Jewish, to be invested in doing something connected to Jewish culture. Very important steps in rebuilding Jewish life, but also taking care of the properties, Jewish communal properties, was reorganization of the Jewish community and the creation of the Union of Jewish Communities in Poland. And that union, which was then recognized by the government in 1997, a special law was created, which allows Jewish community to reclaim the communal properties. The Jewish communities were still small and I wouldn't say weak, but they were not strong enough to do all of this on their own. That's why World Jewish Organization joined to help them, because there was only 5 years to put claims for all the cemeteries and synagogues, which were all over Poland. The Foundation for the Preservation of Jewish Heritage in Poland was created, a foundation which handled a lot of this restitution issues, because the 9 Jewish communities in Poland were only able to handle certain amount of cases. That organization was then headed by Monika Krawczyk, a Jewish attorney from Poland. And together with Jewish communities, they put thousands and thousands of cases and claims, mostly towards Jewish cemeteries, synagogues, and mikvot, and many, many other buildings. That started a different issue. Jewish communities started claiming properties which were heavily neglected. It means from the moment when they were Jewish community became an owner of it, we are now responsible for taking care of this. And the biggest problem is with Jewish cemeteries, because they need proper care, they need to be fenced, they need to be protected. Gravestones need to be renovated. And it's I would say, the biggest halakhical religious obligation towards those particular places. So the financial issues started of how can we balance that? Can we sell other properties or invest other properties in a different way to be able to afford the preservation effort of other properties, and especially those who have the most religious significance? That issue never went well publicly because, of course, many people protested, because if somebody reclaims a synagogue, but it doesn't have a lot of historical and architectural value and tries to sell it to another organization to afford fencing of the cemetery, then there's many people who come and protest, like, how you're reclaiming synagogue, but then selling it. It was, I would say, it came with a lot of turbulences. What Jewish community did with the buildings, many of them were reclaimed and preserved. One of them was the Yeshiva Chachmei Lublin, which was turned partially into a museum in the synagogue and a mikveh, and partially into a hotel. Similarly, for example, the synagogue in Kazimierz Dolny, but many, many other places. I just gave examples by Jewish community of Warsaw, but many other places were also taken care of by other communities or the Foundation for the Preservation of Jewish Heritage in Poland. American and Israeli and many different organizations joined restoration projects, and part of those projects were spearheaded by Hasidic community, which was very invested in their heritage in Poland. I want to mention here a couple of people, Rabbi Mendel Reichberg, who created a tourist agency, which reestablished a pilgrimage movement of Hasidim into Poland, but he also fenced and rebuilt the ochels, the little kind of buildings, graves of tzaddikim in Poland. Another person was Asher Sharf, also from Brooklyn, who helped to preserve the synagogue in Bobova, the Bobov synagogue, together with Nissenbaum Foundation. Rabbi Reich, who invested in synagogue in Romanov. Not all of those projects were handled beautifully as much as, I would say, the skilled preservation groups would do, but there was first money that came to really protect those places. And we here have a ruin of a synagogue I actually loved the Romanov synagogue as a ruin. Somehow it had this romantic feel, and I would love to preserve it as a ruin. Rabbi Reich rebuilt it, and it serves a beautiful purpose. It's now a center for Hasidim who are traveling for pilgrimage. But that work was not particularly done with a taste of a preservation. It was almost like a renovation of a beautiful old building, not exactly in a preservation standard. Situation with the synagogue in Bobova was done differently. That synagogue was preserved in a more proper way. Moving forward, because we still have a lot of slides. As the preservation efforts started and commemoration efforts also started in many different places, the difficulties and conflicts in commemoration and memory started as well in Poland. Many of those surrounded Auschwitz. You probably heard about the issues in the late 90s about convent being located on the side of Auschwitz-Birkenau, and it needed to be moved because of Jewish protests. Many of you maybe also heard in 1998 issues connected to crosses next to the Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum. There is a big difficulty here when we speak about sites, which are the sites of mass murder, both of Christians and Jews. Pope John Paul II visited Auschwitz with a good faith, conducted a mass for hundreds and thousands of people who came to pray on this next to the site of Auschwitz-Birkenau, and that Pope's cross was left there to commemorate his visit. But many Jews felt it's offensive to them. The problem is when the Jewish community appealed for that particular cross to be removed, then ultranationalist groups started bringing more crosses, because for them it was like a holy battle over cross. Site of Auschwitz-Birkenau is a site of Polish and Christian martyrology as well. So it spearheaded a lot of conflicts, which needed to be settled in the right way. The other problem was the issue of complicity of some of the citizens of Poland. And that research started in the 90s. Research about very difficult topics like, for example, pogrom in Jedwabne. And Polish community is still split, even though the pogrom in Jedwabne is quite well investigated. And we can for sure say that unfortunately it was the Polish neighbors who killed their Jewish neighbors. But many people in the Polish community do not want to admit that guilt. And the difficulty especially started when the Polish president, Mr. Kwaśniewski, 10 years before that photo, stood there on the first ceremony commemorating this massacre. And he, from himself as a Pole and as Polish president, apologized for that crime. It was a very noble thing to do, but it didn't sit well with ultranationalists who are still contesting that crime happened from the hands of Polish nation. And there are many theories which they are creating about this. Because of many difficulties happened in Auschwitz and other places of martyrology, International Auschwitz Council was created. And it stayed for multiple years discussing issues surrounding Auschwitz-Birkenau and other prominent Holocaust sites. And that group consisted of scholars and survivors who discussed the most difficult issues and advised the Prime Minister of Poland and the Minister of Culture on dealing with certain topics. The next step in commemoration was creation of modern museums. And here, just two examples, the modern museums were many But one is Galicia Museum, created by Chris Schwartz, who realized that many people visit Krakow and Auschwitz, but never make it to Galicia. And he had this wonderful set of photographs, which he made all over Galicia about the Jewish heritage. And he turned it into an exhibit for those who are not able to make that travel, which he made, to be able to see what was left in many different towns. And a little synagogue in town of Oświęcim, Auschwitz Jewish Center, currently a beautiful museum of a history of town of Oświęcim and a place of dialogue and different programs. It was created by Fred Schwartz from New York, and Fred was joined by many different philanthropies from here. And now it's associated with the Museum of Jewish Heritage downtown in Manhattan. Polin Museum, the Museum of History of Polish Jews as a big institution, speaking about 900 years of Jewish history in Poland. The project was started in 1993, but it took almost 20 years for the museum to be completed. The one important thing about this museum is that it's a first partnership in between Polish government and Jewish organizations in creating a museum that would have a narrative which is, I would say, free of politics of memory. And that was an issue till the current times. There are some problems, but that museum was created in a way that the government was paying for the building and construction, and the Jewish community was chipping in funds into creating the exhibit and making sure that the narrative speaks about the history of Polish Jews in an unpoliticized way. Preservation efforts at Auschwitz-Birkenau. Ronald Lauder, who supported rebirth of Jewish life in Poland, also visited Auschwitz many times and realized that that place is literally collapsing. He brought in to Auschwitz a group of preservation specialists from Metropolitan Museum of Art to do an investigation what can be done and what needs to be established. And he established a first very professional lab. It looks a little bit like Smithsonian. It's a preservation lab where every single item of the Holocaust victims and every single document connected to Auschwitz-Birkenau and an artifact, they're all treated almost like pieces of art. Their preservation is done with a very thorough documentation to make sure that those pieces, those hundreds and thousands of pieces, will be treated as an evidence of the crime for many, many years, and they will not disintegrate. And that amazing approach of treating Holocaust artifacts as almost pieces of art turned the preservation in Poland of Holocaust sites into a completely different place. After that lab was established and the first work was done, the administration of Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum investigated the state of the buildings and state of everything what is in there. And they realized that really those temporary created buildings during the war, after 70 years, are on the edge of collapsing. And they created a plan of preservation. The only problem was that the Holocaust survivors, those who were in the International Auschwitz Council, alarmed the large community that that preservation cannot be only handled by the government, because it will be subject of the budget cuts, and it will be a subject of political issues like the crosses. And it needs to be done independent. And the foundation was created, the Auschwitz-Birkenau Foundation, which handles the preservation of Auschwitz and funds the preservation of Auschwitz. The issue arose: who should pay for preservation of Auschwitz? Is it supposed to be Polish government, who was also taking care of many, many other Holocaust sites, or it needs to be a joint effort by many different countries? And Auschwitz-Birkenau Foundation came with an idea that they will appeal to many different countries to create an endowment fund and treat it as an international heritage and an international monuments for victims from many different countries. And they reached to over 30 or probably now over 40 countries and created a large endowment fund, mostly supported by Germany, but also by other countries in many different amounts. And that endowment fund is able to independently kick about $5 million every single year. And it's not a subject of budget cuts of, for example, Polish government. And they can employ people at Auschwitz-Birkenau Museum and stick to a very strict preservation plan to make sure that those buildings will not be renovated or reconstructed. They will be actually preserved in a certain state, and they will be able to stay authentic, because authenticity serves as the reminder of the truth, what happened, and it serves as an evidence of the crime. Many different things also happened in Poland. You would not even think about the groups of people who joined the commemoration efforts, like, for example, the Polish Strongmen. If any of you is interested in that particular sport, Poles are quite good. They are probably the best in the world. And they joined cleaning up of the cemeteries, because those gravestones are quite heavy, and sometimes it's impossible to take heavy machinery on the sides of the cemeteries. So they were bringing different gravestones from the paved roads and from different places, and it created also additional interest in different groups on preserving local heritage. Forgotten mass graves. For many, many years, commemoration was going very slow in this particular area. Almost every single town has a mass grave. Some of them have it on the site of Jewish cemetery because it was used as a site of execution in many towns. But in other towns, it's basically a local forest where a group of people, usually elderly and children, were marched and killed on spot. But there are also other places like this particular one here in Hobot Forest, which is a great sorry, somebody is unmuted, which is a grave site of 12 Jews who were for over a year hiding in a hiding spot in forest, and they were discovered and then shot, and their hiding spot, their bunker, was turned then into a mass grave. And there are many of these Holocaust sites, and they are just being discovered, and there is a foundation which is called Forgotten, and it deals with all those forgotten places. They read different testimonies from the past to identify those places. They try to interview locals to figure out where is the actual spot. And if there is not enough funds to create a larger monument, they commemorate it with a wooden matzeva. But those places also carry different historical significance. I want to show you in this particular spot what I found. When I read testimonies about this particular spot, I read a testimony of a Polish man who said, in the last time I saw them, they were cooking a meal next to their bunker. When you walk through this forest, you see nothing but forest. But what identifies this place is the little hill where the bunker was and the pots which were left after those who were there. And the question is, what can we do? How we can preserve it? Should we take it to the museum, or should we leave it right there to serve as a reminder? Those pots are still in there. And even though multiple museums were contacted and some of them expressed interest in that, but this particular spot was just discovered a couple of years ago, and the pots are still there. We just started bringing groups of tourists into that spot. And I particularly think that we can put spots in the museum, but bringing a group into a place like that, when unpreserved pots are part of the nature, and you tell the story and you can actually see that this is what happened there, it can be important as well to let it be not necessarily preserved and put in the museum or a storage facility, because not everything can be displayed. What happens after the new government, which is a current government, came into power, and I had questions before in our informal Q&A with the students, is the commemoration efforts did not stop. Many local communities are still cleaning up the cemeteries. They are doing many positive things in the communities. The kids are taught about the Holocaust, about the Jewish culture. All this is still happening. And it's an amazing thing, an amazing movement in Poland. The problem which happened is the switch of narrative and the politics which spearheaded heaviness of anti-Semitism in the language in Poland. So the first part is the government, which we currently have in Poland, is a populist government. And unfortunately, there is a certain amount of hate speech in the language of politicians. When you have hate speech in language of politicians, it always allows public to use that hate speech. So when I lived in Poland, I did not particularly feel anti-Semitism because everybody would shush a person who is an anti-Semite because it was not politically correct. But when a populist government comes into power and they use hate speech language, then the hate speech and anti-Semitism comes back to the street. I don't know if particularly anti-Semitism is heavier now, but anti-Semitism is definitely much more visible because it's being allowed. So the problem started in a couple areas. One of them was the Museum of the History of Polish Jews, which was created by the Jewish community in large part on the exhibit side, decided to do an exhibit commemorating the 50th anniversary of March 68, that big expulsion of Polish Jews connected to the anti-Semitic campaign. And although that's a historical exhibit as the last component of the exhibit, because they feel that the responsibility of institution is also to touch the hearts of the people about the current events, they decided to place an exhibit about hate speech now. And they put quotes from different public figures and politicians, not necessarily putting their names under it, but the quotes which are considered hate speech. And that didn't sit well with many people and created a big fuss because especially if those prominent figures were in power, they didn't want it as the end of this exhibit being treated as those who are in any bed. And that created a big conflict between the government and the Museum of History of Polish Jews, which resulted of Dr. Stola, who was a director of Polin Museum, not being appointed for the next term, even though he was chosen by independent commission to be a director of the museum. And that was long standing conflict in press. Probably many of you, if you're interested in Polish Jewish issues, saw that Dr. Stola is an amazing speaker, spoke in America many, many times. The other part is the censorship of topics connected to complicity of Poles in crimes of Holocaust. And I'm not saying complicity of Poland, because Poland as a country and as a nation in whole was not complicit in crimes of Holocaust, but there were groups of people who unfortunately were. And this research is done by many prominent historians, and some of them like Barbara Engelking and Yani Aguerski were especially affected a lot by the law created by Poland. It's the anti-defamation law. That censorship was really difficult. It was not only difficult for scholars, but also for tour guides, because you need to really watch your language, how you speak about those crimes. The other problem is that all this research, which was done, and it started in the 90s, about the difficult topics in the Polish history, it didn't stop. It's just not funded by government, because the government has more of an agenda of, the Polish pride. We are heroes and we are righteous among the nations. So narrative is the biggest problem over here. I'm not particularly thinking that the government is against preserving Jewish heritage or preserving memory of Holocaust, but the government has a very political agenda. And that political agenda is the Polish nationalist agenda of the pride. We are heroes, we are righteous among the nations. So the money of the government is still spent towards commemoration issues, but it's directed to different institutions. Even before that particular government, PIS government, came to power, the Museum of Righteous Poles Rescuing Jews in Markowa was created and under construction, but it was dedicated and opened under the new ruling government. It's an important institution, and it should always be open for the public. The one thing which I would like to mention is that the governmental agenda is minimalizing righteousness of the righteous among the nation. And if we are claiming that all people in Poland were righteous, and then we're not giving the proper recognition for those who really deserve this museum. The other museums were also supported by the new government, like Warsaw Ghetto Museum. It was also an idea which was created before this government came to power, but the government fully supported this museum. The museum also gave, the government also gave money for the commemoration and preservation of Jewish cemetery in Warsaw. So things are still happening. The positive things are still happening, but a lot of scholars and historians are worried about the narrative. The narrative is shifted towards righteousness, towards heroism, but we are minimalizing difficult issues, which we need to reconcile to move forward. Local projects still continue. Local amazing people are still cleaning cemeteries, making sure that there are people on the anniversaries in the local towns that commemorate bad events that happen. And for example, this is a picture of Olympic medalist in canoeing, Mr. Dariusz Popiela, who spearheaded multiple restoration projects in his communities, fundraised for them, spent his own time on making sure that all of this happened. So when we speak about the difficulties which we have with the current government, who creates this narrative, which clearly it's not very historically correct, that is emphasizing on one side, but forgets the difficult side. But the discussion in between both sides in Poland created something which is positive. And that positive thing is the response of the Poles towards the conflict in Ukraine. The government was not as quick as the local community. The Poles decided that if they can help Ukrainians, they will come to the border, they will pack their cars, they will create supplies. Almost all efforts connected to helping refugees in Poland are done by the new generation of Poles who care. And this is something amazing. It's not picture perfect, unfortunately. There are bad situations. And look, Poland is helping Ukrainians. Poles and Ukrainians are almost brothers and sisters. It's not helping a full stranger. And then other people are saying, oh, but there are groups who are being discriminated. Just a half year earlier in Poland, there was a border crisis with representatives of Muslim and Arab communities who were trying to come through the border of Belarus. That was actually a provocation staged by Vladimir Putin, who shipped those people into Belarus and wanted to create and steer the response of Poles to be negative towards the groups of the refugees who were then trapped on the border for a long time. But I would not say that the bad stuff which happened to the refugees the months before should diminish good things which are happening now. Because during that time, when this was happening, there was still a very large group of people who were speaking towards helping those people who are trapped. Those people were put in a political situation of being trapped in between two borders, and nobody wanted to help them. But there were a group of people who I would call righteous people in Poland, who against the government and against everything tried to create humanitarian aid for those people who were trapped. I want to end this lecture with a quote from a survivor, another of heroes of mine, Roman Kent. He also died last year. Last year was tough with all the important people dying in the Polish-Jewish history. Roman coined 11th commandment, a very important one, which speaks both to preservation of Holocaust, commemoration, but also for current events and all these issues connected to righteousness. His commandment is, do not be indifferent. And that's the end of my presentation. And I welcome all the questions. Thank you.